My name is Charlotte Wethington, and I'm Casey's mom. I never thought that Casey would have a disease that was socially unacceptable, but he did. I did not even really know about the disease of addiction until it happened to our son. Growing up, I thought that Casey was just a typical little boy that liked to take risk. I didn't see that as a warning sign that Casey would be willing to try drugs and other things that might be harmful to him. I should have. I didn't think about the fact that Casey was genetically predisposed to addiction because there was substance misuse on both sides of our family. I didn't know at that time that 50% of the risk for addiction is genetic. And because I lived in a box, I didn't really realize the affordability, accessibility, and availability of drugs in our community and the surrounding communities. When I say I lived in a box, I lived in a very safe place that contained my family, my home, my school, and my church. And I didn't feel like that I needed to be concerned about anything else that was going on around me. At one point in time, Casey said to me, "Mom, where do you live?" Because he realized that I was living in a place that didn't really exist. I was living in my own little world, failing to see what was the reality. I guess in a way, maybe I was just trying to protect myself from what I feared was happening. I didn't really know that Casey was using drugs until he had already enrolled in college and was no longer living in our home. I suspected, but I really had never found any proof. And believe me, I had looked and I had searched and I had questioned Casey because I knew as a parent that was my job, to be in his business as much as I could, to try to direct him in a good way and in a healthy way. But I wasn't finding anything. And so I had been taught, not only as a teacher, but even from my mom, that when you accuse someone of doing something, if they're not, then they feel like maybe they have to live up to that accusation. And I never wanted to accuse Casey of doing something that he wasn't doing, because I wanted him to think and to know that I believed in him and that I knew that he was a good person, which is what I tell people all the time. Casey was a good person who made a bad decision to use drugs the first time. And when I speak to students, I always say, there's only one way that you will know that you will never become addicted, and that's by never using the first time. Because what I know is that Casey never intended to become addicted. But that's what happened. Because when he used that first time, Casey had the brain that said, as I heard one young woman say one evening, "Aha, I like that and I want more." So when Casey started smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol and smoking pot, that was just the beginning of his drug use that continued on until he met heroin. in elementary school, I tried to make sure that the friends that Casey had were people that we wanted him to be with. And, you know, at one point Casey said that we didn't think that anybody was good enough to play with him, and that wasn't the case, but he saw it that way, because there was one little boy in particular that he wanted to be with, and even though we tried really hard to prevent him from being with this person, he always found a way. And later I would say to him, Casey, maybe I just wasn't strict enough with you. And he said, I would have found a way, Mom. I would have found a way. It was never about you guys. It was always about me. I don't know what it was with Casey that he felt like he needed to use drugs or wanted to use drugs to begin with. But I do know that when he started out using, he never intended to become addicted. But I know that he crossed that line at some point and then did not know how to get back. Casey graduated from high school, and during that last year of high school was the first time that we had ever been told that someone else suspected that Casey was using. It was one of his teachers at high school. And so that was, that was devastating to hear. And of course, Casey denied it. He said, that he had not smoked pot that morning. And besides, pot was just an herb, right? Who made it? And he was just trying to rationalize his behavior. And what troubles me now is that there is movement to legalize pot, because I know for a lot of young people, pot has been the gateway to other drugs. And I think we're really seeing and hearing what's happening in other states where it's been legalized, and the news is not that bright. In fact, it's kind of bleak and concerning and troubling. And so Casey graduated from high school. He went on to college, to the University of Cincinnati, and he continued to live with us for several semesters. And during that time, he was on the dean's list, and I thought, well, that's good. We've rounded the corner, and everything's going to be okay. And the counselor that he had seen in high school was right. He maybe has taken some risk, but he's going to be okay. He is the kind of kid that likes to walk on the edge, but he's not going to go over the edge. He's going to go to college. He's going to get a degree. He'll get a good job. He'll get married. He'll have children. I'll be a grandmother. I had it all figured out. But that's not what happened. Because what happened was that when Casey wasn't living at home, we knew less about who he was with, what he was doing, and how his drug use was progressing. Casey came home one evening after he had moved out of our home, and he said that he was going out for a little bit and he would be back. I noticed when he left that evening that he didn't take his backpack with him. And I had convinced myself that since I couldn't find anything anywhere else in the house, that what he was hiding must be in that backpack, because it was like another appendage on Casey. Wherever he went, that backpack was with him. So when he left that evening and he didn't have his backpack with him, I went in his room and looked in his closet, and there it was. When I opened it up, there was a container of marijuana, yay high. I took it out I showed it to my husband, and he said, yeah, that's what it is. And quicker than I can tell you about it, he took the marijuana buds in that container down to the basement and burned them up in the fireplace. I said, just like Cheech and Chong, it was up in smoke. When Casey came home that evening, he, of course, went to his room, and obviously he had checked his backpack, because I followed him in his room that evening, and he was sitting on his futon with his head in his hands, and he said to me, "You don't know what you've done." At that point, I'm sure I didn't know what I had done, because you see, I didn't think about the person that he had gotten that pot from, who he owed money to, probably the money that he was going to make by selling the pot. I don't know how he resolved that problem. All I know is that we did not finance it. You know, unlike a lot of other families that I've talked to that have told me about how their children have stolen from them, have taken everything out of their house, so that they have nothing left, virtually nothing left in their homes of any value that could be sold. Casey never did do that. We did not miss things in our home. So I guess, you know, I really don't know how he financed his drug use, except probably by selling. And maybe other means too that I actually choose not to think about. So we have this conversation with him that makes absolutely no sense. He says that he thought that his dad and I would smoke it with him. I said I knew he was high that night, because there was no way that we were going to do that. We don't smoke cigarettes, we don't drink, we don't use substances that are not intended to be used by prescription. He was trying to rationalize his drug use, saying that, you know, who made it, Mom, and it's just an herb, and all the arguments that, or some of the arguments that we are hearing now for legalization of marijuana. So time goes on, and I continued to have concerns about Casey. In fact, he would say every time he came to our house, it was like a counseling session. He said, "Mom, I don't have a problem. If you want me to get one, I will. Will that make you happy?" And I said, "No, Case, that won't make me happy." And so, like I said, time goes on, and I continue to have concerns. I continue to try to talk to Casey about it. And nothing is changing, really. And so, Thanksgiving of 2001, Casey was at our home, and he said, "Those people I'm living with have got on my last nerve. I'm moving home. I'm coming home." And I tried every other tactic I knew to get through to Casey and to get to the bottom of what was going on. And so I decided, well, tough love is in order. So I said to him, "Well, not without a job, you're not." He didn't come home. And then it got to be close to Casey's birthday. And we met him at a restaurant close to where he was living at the time. And as soon as he walked in, I said, "What's the matter, Case?" And he said, "Oh, nothing." You know, I ask students when I speak to them, how many of you have walked into a room, you've never said a word, and your mother has looked at you and said, What's the matter? And I see heads nodding all around the room. And I say, well, you know, moms just know stuff. The tragedy with Casey is that I didn't trust what I knew. I didn't trust myself and the feeling that I had that something was wrong. I put my trust in people who were the professionals, who I thought knew how to assess Casey and figure out what was going on with him. I put my trust in lay people and people who were in the program that I felt like were the best people to inform me of what was going on with Casey. The best that I got from any person that I talked to, regardless of their position, was that Casey had to want to, lose enough, and hit bottom. I believed that at the time. So we sat down to lunch that day, and Casey almost fell asleep in his plate. I didn't realize at the time that what I was looking at was nodding out. Casey obviously had used right before he came to have lunch with us. When we got ready to leave the restaurant that day, I said to Casey, I said, Casey, you should not be driving. No kidding. And when I said to him again that, you know, something was wrong, he said he was just tired. He left that day, we left that day, and when I got in the car with my husband, I said, something's really wrong with Casey. And he said, well, what did he say? And I said, well, he said he was just tired. And I said, and then my husband said, well, maybe he was. Maybe he is, maybe that's what's the matter. And I thought to myself, were you sitting at the same table where I was sitting? Because that's not what I was seeing. You know, that just shows the power of denial. Don't even notice I am lying. You know, the denial on my part had ended quite a while back, but my husband still was suffering from that malady of denial and did not want to see what was going on with Casey. You know, at one time I had said to my husband, I said, you don't think Casey is using drugs, do you? And of course he answered in the way that he knew I wanted him to, and he said no, he didn't think so. Of course, none of us want to think that our children could be the ones that would be using drugs, that our loved ones would be the ones to be using drugs. No one wants to think that. We don't want to admit what we're seeing when we're seeing it. My biggest regret in all of this is not trusting myself. You know, I heard from a counselor after the fact that if you think something is wrong, there probably is, and you need to act on it now. I wish that I had heard that long before then. I wish that I had heard that when I was in crisis with Casey. I hope that you can hear that now as I'm saying it to you. If you think that something is wrong, there probably is. Act on it now. That's the best advice and the only advice I ever really give people. Casey was with us then again on Christmas Day. He said, "I don't know. I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I look like to do to have fun anymore. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know." He repeated that over and over and over again. What I didn't realize was that what he was trying to tell us was that he no longer was himself. You know, I know that drugs, first of all, took Casey's brain. Then the drugs took the spirit of who Casey was. And then the drugs took his life. They took it all, and they didn't stop until they did. Because what I know now is addiction is a progressive disease, a chronic progressive brain disease. That night when Casey left our home, I hugged him and kissed him, told him I loved him, and that I was there whenever he was ready. You see, I believed that Casey had to be ready, because that's what everybody told me he had to be. What I didn't realize was how far Casey was into his addiction, and that the addiction was to heroin. In February of 2002, Casey called home and he said, "Mom, I need help. I'm in trouble. I'm addicted to OxyContin." And I thought, hallelujah, he's finally admitted it. Now we can get somewhere. Now we're going to get the help that Casey needs. And I said, "Well, Casey, I'll come and get you tonight." And he said, "No, Mom, I'll be home in the morning, I promise." When Casey came home the next morning, as soon as he came in the front door, he said, "Where are we going, Mom?" Because you see, Casey knew that I had been trying to get help for him. I had been talking to everybody and anybody that I thought could help us with Casey. I had talked to my doctor that wished me good luck. And that was all. I had talked to all the other people that kept saying he had to want to, lose enough, hit bottom. That was the best I got. Good luck, and he has to do all these things before he can get better. So, ironically enough, Casey called the agency that operates the detox unit that he called that morning, that I ended up working for 10 years. And what he was told that day when he called the drogie detox unit is, unfortunately, a lot of times what people are told even to this day. And that is that there wasn't a bed for Casey, that he had to keep calling back. I said, to tell someone that's in crisis in their addiction, they've had that moment, that moment of clarity, that moment of clearness of mind enough to know that there's something desperately wrong and they need help, to tell them that they have to wait and that they have to call back would be like telling a heart attack victim, "Take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning if you're still living and breathing." Because what we know is that withdrawal is what a person who's addicted fears the most. And that the only thing that's going to solve that problem is to use again. And with heroin, each use can be the last use. So fortunately, we had the money to get Casey into a program in Falmouth, Kentucky. And so that day before we left the house, Casey said to us, "I just want to be normal." Because you see, Casey was into his addiction so much that it was no longer about the getting high so much anymore as it was just being normal, just being able to function. Casey went to that detox unit that day, and the first thing we were told was that if he decided to leave, he could, and there was nothing they could do about it. And that's exactly what he did 6 days later. We went to visit Casey every night that he was at that unit. And on one occasion, there was a man who had befriended Casey, an older gentleman who was there. He had gotten addicted to pain medication, and he was there to get treatment. And he called me to the side and he said, "You know, Casey's making noises like he wants to leave. Let's do an intervention." I didn't know what an intervention was or how to do it, never heard of it. That's long before there was intervention on television. So I said, okay. So we went down to the nurse's station, and he told them that Casey was wanting to leave, that he thought it would be good to do an intervention on Casey. The nurses pushed themselves away from the desk, folded their arms, and said, "If he doesn't want to stay, there's nothing we can do." That was the end of it. Casey left the next day. He didn't come to our house. He went back to where he had been living. And of course, his drug use continued. In May of that year, we were out of town, and my mom got the call that Casey had overdosed. She went to the hospital, and by the time we got there the next day, he was off the respirator, and he was wanting to go home. His dad had to take some tape that was in the room where Casey was and wrap the gown he was in around him for him to leave the hospital because he didn't know where his clothes were. You see, he had overdosed that night along with another young man. The other young man's mom was close by and could get to him. We were about 5 hours away. And they drove, some of the other people that were at this party, drove Casey around Covington, actually, to get the opinion of another drug user to make sure that Casey was overdosing. You see, they didn't want to take him to the hospital and Casey wake up and be mad at them. Also, I'm sure one of them was more concerned about getting into trouble because of some issues that he had with the police. Although he did come to the hospital that next day to check on Casey. You know, that's why the Good Samaritan law is so important, allowing people to call knowing that they're not going to get in trouble for calling for help for someone. So we took Casey home with us that day, and as we walked down the hall of the hospital, he said, "Mom, I have a love affair with heroin." Now remember, Casey had said he was addicted to OxyContin. I said, "Casey, why did you tell us OxyContin if it was heroin?" He said, "I thought it would sound better, Mom." You know, not only is there great stigma and discrimination around this disease, there's great shame to it as well. And heroin is supposed to be like the worst of the drugs, that anybody can stoop to that level. Casey did come home with us that day, and he stayed for a little while. He left and he relapsed. Came home and stayed a little while longer, and he left again and he relapsed. Both times I took him to Christ Hospital. Unfortunately, our medical professionals lack adequate training in addiction, so that there are so many doctors and nurses who do not know how to treat a person who is addicted. Casey was given Ativan and Ambien that night, drugs that are contraindicated for a person who is addicted to opiates. He was also told that night that there was only one thing that he had to change in his life, and that was everything. I know that must have been terrifying for Casey. So on both of those occasions, we left, and without any help, without any referral, without any kind of follow-up treatment, and we went home. In June, the end of June, Casey was out of town. He was in Indiana. He had gone to a concert in Noblesville. Right before that, he had managed to stay off of anything. He said he hadn't been taking anything for 20 days. He had been with us, and we thought things were getting better because we had no clue about addiction. We really didn't. And when Casey said, "I got myself into this, Mom, I can get myself out," we wanted so much to believe that, as much as he believed it. Because I do think Casey believed it. He believed that if he just had the willpower, if he was just strong enough, that he could beat this by himself. He couldn't. So he was arrested and taken to jail. He called from jail and said, "Mom, big mistake, I got arrested, and I need you to come and get me." By this time, we had somewhat figured out that the only way that we were going to be able to get help for Casey was if he did get arrested. And actually, we were just rejoicing in the fact that he was there, thinking that finally, we were going to get help for Casey. Somebody was going to be able to intervene on him in a way that was going to help him to recover. So that Monday, we went up to Noblesville, Indiana, accompanied by 2 of our 12-step friends. When we got up there, we were a little early, so we had time to go to a restaurant and write out Casey's drug history as we knew it. I wanted to be able to give that to the judge that day and beg for treatment for Casey. So we went to the courtroom. When the bailiff walked in, I said, "I have something I'd like to give to the judge." And she said, "Well, we're not here to deal with that today. He's going to be released on his own recognizance." I shook those papers at her and said, "I'm trying to save my son's life." She said very coolly, "You'll just have to take those papers down to the prosecuting attorney's office. They'll make a copy of it," and that was it. I did, they did. I came back to the courtroom, and Casey was released. After his release, we tried to do an intervention with Casey. That was a failure because I, again, was misinformed about how an intervention should go. And during that intervention, the interventionist said, well, he was a counselor who said he had done interventions before, said, I don't think Casey's as addicted as he wants us to believe. That might have been an accurate statement if that person had ever seen or talked to our son. He had not. I was going to that person trying to, again, figure out what in the world we were going to do to save our son. Well, needless to say, that the intervention went nowhere. In May, Casey overdosed again, or I'm sorry, not in May. In August, Casey overdosed again. Casey had overdosed, as I said, in May for the first time. He overdosed again in August, and Casey overdosed in May. He was sober for 20 days. He overdosed again in June, and then again in August. The overdose in June was after he had been sober for 20 days. So his first overdose was May. His second overdose was June. His third overdose was August the 9th of 2002. Casey had come to us in February. 6 months later, he had the fatal overdose. We were called to the hospital on August the 9th, to University Hospital, where he had been taken by a friend. When we got there, Casey was in a coma. At that point in time, we were asked what we wanted to do. Did we want a feeding tube for Casey? Yes, we did. A little bit later, did we want to have a cage put in his lung to capture the blood clots? Yes, we did. And finally, did we want to turn off the life support? 10 days later, on August the 19th. No, we didn't. But that was the only choice that we were left with. You know, when Casey was alive, when we had the opportunity to make some choices for him that could have saved his life, we were denied that right, that ability to do that, because we were being told that Casey had the right to choose, that we were trying to take his rights away from him. We weren't trying to take his rights away from him. We were trying to give him the right to live. You know, what I say now about bottom, when people want to talk bottom, I say, well, here's what the bottom line is. The bottom line is you have to be alive to recover. And at that point in time, there was no hope for Casey. There was no hope that he was going to recover. And so we had to give the word to take off the life support and let Casey go. So on August the 19th, we let Casey go. On August the 22nd, we buried Casey. I don't know how much after that it was that I called the courthouse in Noblesville, Indiana. I wanted to get the name and the address of the judge so that I could write him a letter and ask him to please intervene the next time that he had an opportunity to do so with some other young man or woman that was in the same situation as Casey. The woman who answered the phone when I told her who I was and why I was, or who I was calling in regard to, she said, well, we have a warrant out for his arrest. You see, Casey had been given a warning when he left the courtroom that day in Noblesville, Indiana, that he could receive a summons to appear in court within 90 days. He got that summons. The problem was it was the day of his funeral. Too late. So I told the lady on the phone, I said, well, good luck. He's at Spring Grove Cemetery today. I told her that I had wanted the judge to order treatment for Casey. And she said, well, you don't understand how the system works. And I said, well, if that's how the system works, there's something wrong with the system. I said, I don't know if that was my epiphany or not, but sometime after that, and I don't really even know the exact date that I made that phone call, but I made a phone call to my state representative because I had found out at a meeting, actually, one of my meetings, that there was a law in Florida called the Marchman Act that allowed family to intervene on loved ones with a substance use disorder. So I knew that Kentucky would not be setting a precedent if they initiated or passed a law like that. So when I called my state representative, I told him about it. I asked him if he would be willing to introduce similar legislation in Kentucky. He said he would. And so he introduced it in 2003. Casey died in August. I was on the phone with my representative probably around October, November. And in January of 2003, it was introduced in the Kentucky legislature. It didn't pass that first session. And actually, it died in committee the second legislative session in 2004. But we found a way to use another bill as a vehicle for getting Casey's language passed. And that's what we did. So in 2004, we were able to pass the Matthew Casey Wethington Act for Substance Abuse Intervention in the state of Kentucky, which allows parents, relatives, and/or friends to petition the court on behalf of someone who has a substance use disorder, regardless of age and without any criminal charges. And that can be done, like I said, by a parent, relative, and/or friend. Because these aren't just children. These are mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, other loved ones that are in need of some kind of a hopeful intervention. In 2012, there was similar legislation passed in Ohio. It is found in Senate Bill 117. It is not exactly as Casey's Law in Kentucky. We refer to it as Casey's Law in Ohio, but it is similar and somewhat modeled after Casey's Law. It is a way of intervening on a loved one without any criminal charges. You know, what we do to people when we incarcerate them is set up another barrier to their recovery. When they can't get housing, they can't get a job, they are not able to participate in be engaged civically, have the right to vote. It just sets up other barriers so that it makes recovery even more difficult than it already is, because recovery is some of the hardest work that a person will ever do to try to recover from the disease of addiction. The good news is that it can be done, and that we have millions of people today living in recovery. That's what we wanted for Casey. We wanted him to have the opportunity to see what recovery could look like, to take him from that hopeless place to a hopeful place. I was able to get some guys from a 12-step meeting to come and do a 12-step on Casey in our home one evening during that 20 days that he was not using, at least not using heroin. And they took him to a meeting that evening. And the next day, Casey said, "Mom, do you know what, at that meeting, what people still call themselves?" And I said, "Addicts?" And he said, "Yeah. What hope do I have? What hope do I have?" You see, for Casey, that was not hopeful. Instead of seeing that as something miraculous, that people were still in recovery after 20 years, he saw that as being still in a hopeless situation. I am so grateful to Casey for helping me to step out of the box that I lived in, for allowing me to be able to be the voice for him, and hopefully for other families who are suffering from the same disease, to advocate for recovery. I am so very grateful to be able to be a person on the phone to help other families, the voice that I so longed for when we were in crisis with Casey. We know so much more about addiction than we did in 2002. 14 years ago, we've learned a lot. And when we know better, we can do better. We can do so much better than what we've done in the past. We can make it so that people who are addicted can get the treatment they need and deserve when they need it, not 6 months later, when maybe it's too late. You know, I told the person on the phone that day that Casey didn't have 90 days that a person who's addicted may not have 90 minutes. We need to act, and we need to act now. I'm so grateful to be able to help families to understand the disease of addiction better than we understood it. Because as I said, we were uninformed and then we were misinformed. And what I would say to you is, be informed. Learn all that you can about the disease of addiction. And know that not everyone is going to recover in the same way. I believe what William L. White says, and he is a nationally known recovery advocate who has it's been published numerous times, has numerous white papers and articles that he's written, and a book that he has written called Slaying the Dragon, The History of Addiction, Treatment, and Recovery in America. He says, recovery whatever it takes. I agree with him. Recovery whatever it takes. Because if recovery is our goal, then we have to do everything possible that we can to help a person recover. You know, that's what we do for any other disease, any other chronic illness. My husband was diagnosed with cancer in 2008. 6 months later, he was in remission from his cancer. Why? Because he got the treatment that he needed and deserved. And he got it right away. That's what we need for people who have the disease of addiction. We all make bad choices. That doesn't define who we really are. I know that there are people living today in part because Casey lived and died to the disease of addiction. In part because there is a Casey's Law for other people who have the same disease that he did. There's a lot of other things that come into play for a person to recover. Intervention is part of that. Stopping the progression of the disease. You know, addiction is just like any other chronic progressive disease. The sooner it's recognized, the longer it's treated, the better the chances for recovery. I would just end by saying what I started by saying, and that is, if you think that something is wrong, there probably is. You need to act now. If you want more information about Casey's Law or the law in Ohio, there is some information about that on Casey's website, which is caseyslaw.org.